I don't know what you mean by the word glory, Alice said. Humpty Dumpty smiled contemptuously. Of course you don't, till I tell you. I meant, there's a nice knockdown argument for you. But glory doesn't mean a nice knockdown argument, Alice objected. When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said in a rather scornful tone, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. The question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. The question is, said Humpty Dumpty, which is to be the master? That's all. That little snippet is from Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll. Here's another quote by Lewis Carroll. I maintain that any writer of a book is fully authorized in attaching any meaning he likes to any word he intends to use. That's from Symbolic Logic, Book 10, Chapter 2 by Lewis Carroll. There is a potential hint in the thrill of the chase that may help a few searchers who have yet to find full closure and are still looking for the remaining pieces of their favorite solution. Before I get to it, though, I need to give a big caveat. The interpretation of the potential hint that I'm going to talk about is not supported by the poem. While the interpretation could be a hint to a description of a location, there is nothing in the poem that confirms that, at least not that I've been able to find. So this interpretation would seem to violate Forrest's just the poem and a map statement. And the question for me has always been, if all I need is the poem and a map, how would I find this location with just the poem and a map? No matter how compelling the potential hint, it always comes back to that question. How would I find the location with just the poem and a map? Personally, I have zero confidence in anything that violates Forrest's just the poem and a map statement. But this interpretation may give someone else confidence, and it may help them with closure. And I thought that others might like to hear it as well, so here it is. The interpretation is based on the meaning of words. In The Thrill of the Chase on page 16, Forrest writes the following. But I can't say the sign didn't make a difference in my life, because it did. No one else had a sign, so it was easy to notice, and I used to point it out to all the kids. So here we have Forrest making a big deal about a sign. The sign made a difference. Forrest pointed out the sign to all the kids. The sign Forrest is talking about is for a reserved parking spot for his father. The sign read simply, Mr. Fenn, Principal. This was Mr. Fenn's principal parking sign. If we break down these words, we come up with the following. One synonym for a sign is a hint. Forrest may be pointing out a hint to all the kids. Searchers are the kids. This, then, is a message to searchers telling them to pay special attention because a hint is coming. But this is not just a sign. This is the principal sign. So, this is not just a hint. This is a principal hint, an essential hint, a key hint. We don't know what the hint is yet, but apparently it's big. Skip down a couple of sentences, and Forrest writes, Sometimes John Charles would bring a little jar of green olives to school and wave that thing in my face. Can you imagine that? It was one of those long, thin jars with a green lid, and the olives looked like they were placed in there one at a time. What was that all about, anyway? Can I imagine that? No, I can't. That whole paragraph was weird. What was that all about? Maybe it was something that was meant to catch up in searchers' brains and be a hint to a clue. So now we have olives placed one at a time into a long, thin jar with a green lid. This next part is compelling. An obscure definition for the word olive is an angler's name for the dun of various mayflies, or an artificial fly in imitation of a mayfly. The meaning of the word dun is a shade of the color brown. So to reword the sentence, olive can be an angler's name for the brown color of mayflies, or an artificial fly in imitation of a mayfly. Although the dictionary seems to be indicating the color and not the mayfly, Forrest's use of the word seems to indicate the mayfly and not the color. But maybe Forrest meant both the color and the mayfly. Okay, what about the word jar? Well, a jar is a type of container. What is a container? A container is anything that can contain a quantity of some substance. So we have mayflies, or artificial mayflies, that are placed into a container one at a time. The flies can only enter that particular container one at a time. What about the color of the olives and the jar lid? Forrest said that both were green. He didn't have to specify the color, but he did. In interviews, Forrest seemed to go out of his way to talk about the lid for a different olive jar, the jar that held his autobiography that was contained within the chest. It does seem as though there was something about olive jar lids that Forrest was trying to get across. That might be worth paying attention to, but we don't need it for this video. Maybe all you're looking for is a specific container where an angler's flies can only go in one at a time. Maybe that's the big hint. And since the sign in question was a parking sign, maybe it has something to do with parking as well. I think the olive jar story is a good example of applying Forrest's advice to read the thrill of the chase slowly, looking for anything that might catch up in your brain that might be a hint to help you with the clues. First, find something that stands out and looks like it might be a hint. Second, try to decode that potential hint. And third, try to match the potential hint to the poem. When looking for potential hints, I think that most searchers skipped the third part. Searchers would find something in Forrest's words that stood out. They tried to match that potential hint to a location, and sometimes, when they got a match, the result would look so compelling that their searcher's senses were paralyzed. The location they found had to be correct. Their interpretation of the hint was too good for it to be otherwise, and even if they failed to match the hint to the poem, it did not matter. They were so confident in their interpretation that they set the poem aside and let potential hints, or their interpretation of potential hints, guide them. The problem is that words can have multiple meanings, and potential hints can have multiple interpretations. While the olive jar interpretation that I just talked about may fit certain geographic locations, other interpretations of those same words may fit different locations just as well or better. Every potential hint was subject to that same complication, and the likelihood of confirmation bias when trying to unlock potential hints was huge. This was especially true if you selectively chose which words to use and which words to ignore, like I just did with this olive jar interpretation. For my search, the only interpretations of potential hints that I was interested in were ones that I could directly verify with the poem. If I could not verify the potential hint with the poem, then either that interpretation was wrong or I missed something. In all cases, I erred on the side of caution. Every interpretation of every potential hint was incorrect until I could verify it with the poem. On a related note, even if it seemed as though the poem confirmed an interpretation of a potential hint, that still did not mean that the interpretation was correct. Verifying potential hints with the poem was just the first step in confirming whether the interpretation was correct. But that's going off topic. Getting back to the olive jar, I am not offering an opinion on whether this olive jar interpretation is correct or incorrect. That's not the point of this video. Judging it on its own, however, this is a good interpretation, and I can appreciate a good interpretation of a clue or a hint, even if it leads to an incorrect conclusion. Regarding potential hints, what I am saying is that a significant part of Forrest's puzzle involved the meaning of words, that words can have a lot of different meanings, that the more meanings there are, the more possible interpretations there will be, that at most, only one of those interpretations can be correct, no matter how good other interpretations may look, and that a method is needed to sort the wheat from the chaff. A searcher should have an objective reason for choosing to believe one interpretation over another, or for that matter, for choosing to believe any interpretation at all. The poem itself was the primary component of the method that I used to distinguish between interpretations of potential hints. If an interpretation of a potential hint is not supported by the poem, then it is wrong. But just because I have not figured out how to get a potential hint to connect to the poem does not mean that it cannot be done or that someone else has not already done it. It came down to a choice between being led by the poem and only the poem, or being led by the hints. The misinterpretation of potential hints was probably the primary cause of 300,000 searchers wandering over the 4 search states. And in that sense, the hints can lead anywhere. The poem, on the other hand, the poem can lead to one and only one location. But that's just my opinion. If you're interested, I made a few videos a while back that address these topics in more detail and with more examples. They're entitled The Problem with Hints, Red Herrings, and Enemy Mine Combating Cognitive Bias.